using a grid to help create nice elbow and knee joints is nice, but if you're going to do that, here's some tips that you may want to know about. First, it's a good idea to have your grid setting to 5 for the most precise movement, because there will, 10 and 20 are multiples of 5. Also, you need to know that the grid is not global to all layers. It is specific to each particular layer. So, for example, if I go to layer 1 here and I move that layer, notice that the grid moves with it, but that grid is different on layer 2. Now, if you're trying to use the grid to help create elbow and knee joints, you want the bone layer and your vector layer to have the same grid. So you don't want to ever move the layer when you're using that grid. So before you start your construction, what you really want to do is go to the bone layer and make sure that the position is reset, the scale is reset, and so is the angle, so that you've got 0 for all the positions, 1 for all the scales, and 0 for the angle. And do the same for the other layers as well. Notice here that the position X and Y is offset, so I can press reset there. And now the grids are aligned properly. However, there's at least one other thing that will throw it off, and I'll show that in just a second. So you may ask, how do I move the points and the vectors, if I want to move all of them at once? Well, I would just use the selection tool and select all the points, and then you can transform everything. Now, I drew this particular vector without the grid on. Now I've enabled it. Now, the next thing that you want to be aware of is that as I move this, the point that I am closest to is the one that will snap to the grid. So notice this upper right point is the one that's snapping to the grid, but if I come down to this one here and close to that one, it's now the one that will snap to a grid. Now, you want to make sure, if you're trying to move everything and you want it to snap, that's just to let you know the behavior that will happen. Now, this is the typical construction that you have when you're trying to overlap a joint, and so the points form kind of a circle. Also, it's not necessary to have all of the points line up on grids. You just want to make sure that the center of the bone, the pivot point, aligns with the center of the circle. And so if I want to shrink that, the thing that I want to make sure is that I've got all 4 points, and I can select them and press Alt. First select the transform tool and press Alt, and now I can shrink everything and it will stay centered. But the thing is, you want to make sure that the points that you've selected are forming a circle. So typically you might drag that point down in part of the joint, but if I select that now, or I only select these 3 points and transform them, if I press Alt, it is now not going to stay centered. Notice that these edge points here move away from the center pivot point. So it's very important that if you're going to change the dimension of the circle so that it doesn't align on the grid points, you want to make sure that you have that circle as long as you're making this change in size. Make sure you've got all 4 points selected, and you can then come off the grid, and now things will still manipulate properly. Also, if you're using the grid to create your bones, when I'm scaled in very close, right here I've got a grid size of 5, and I'm zoomed in pretty close. And so when I zoom in really close and I create the bone, it actually does not align exactly with the grid. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, I've talked about the fact that you want to make sure that your layer position, scaling, and angle are all set to the default values. But the other thing that you want to be aware of is paying attention to the orientation of the layer. So as I zoom out here, notice that this layer has one arrow going up and one arrow going to the right, and same thing for layer 2. But watch what happens if I go to that layer and I actually flip the layer. So in that case, let me now zoom in close to the bone. Let me find that bone and zoom in very close, and notice that on layer 2 the grid seems a little offset, and so you might not know what that is, but that's typically the layer has been flipped. So make sure the layer orientation is properly set to the default as well, which is arrow up and arrow right.